Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a pretty fascinating journey, actually. We're going back in time to explore a whole millennium of Indian history.
1,000 years.
Exactly, from AD 0 right up to AD 1000. This whole span covers what's often called India's classical and early medieval age,
Yeah.
and it really laid the groundwork for so much of what came later.
Yeah, and our mission here really is to cut through all the vast amount of information out there. We've sifted through articles, research notes. Basically, we want to pull out the key nuggets.
Give that shortcut.
Right, a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about this incredibly dynamic era. You'll really see how this period profoundly shaped the subcontinent's future.
And profoundly shaped is definitely the right phrase. I mean, you just imagine the sheer scale of change over 1,000 years.
It's huge.
You've got empires rising and falling, arts and sciences flourishing in ways that honestly still resonate today, and these major shifts in religion, in society. It's a real transition point.
Moving from ancient roots into that early medieval phase.
Yeah, and it's just packed with those moments that might make you go, oh, okay, that's why. Those aha moments.
Exactly. And as we dive in, we'll be focusing on a few key themes that really define this millennium. We'll look at the big political shifts, how society evolved.
The structure is changing.
Right, the religious transformations, which were massive, plus the incredible scientific and cultural achievements, and importantly, India's economic connections stretching way across the ancient world.
Okay, so let's set the stage. If we rewind right back to around 80, what does India even look like then?
Well, it's definitely not one single entity.
No, far from it. Down in the Deccan region, you've got the Satavahana dynasty. Pretty powerful. They were big on trade, even linking up with Rome, which is amazing for the time.
And religiously interesting, too.
Yeah, they supported both Brahmanism and Buddhism. And linguistically, they were mainly using Prakrit.
Which is important, these more common vernacular languages, not just the elite Sanskrit. Makes things more accessible.
Definitely. Now, if we shift north.
Okay, north, you've got the Kushan Empire. Now, these rulers were originally from the Yuezhi tribe, so foreign origin. Think Emperor Kanishka, maybe the most famous one.
Right.
And what's really fascinating is how they, as sort of outsiders, used Mahayana Buddhism. It wasn't just faith, it was strategy.
To gain legitimacy.
Exactly. And it did more than that. It helped reshape culture, spirituality, spread ideas along the Silk Road. It turned the Silk Road into more than just a trade route.
A conduit for ideas.
Precisely. And this cultural mix gave us that unique Gandhara art, that blend of Greco-Roman and Indian styles. Really beautiful stuff.
And we can't forget the south either.
Absolutely not. The Tamil kingdoms, the Cholas, Cheras, Pandyas, they were already major players, deeply involved in maritime trade, bustling ports connecting with Rome, Southeast Asia.
So right from the start of this millennium, you've got this incredibly diverse subcontinent, different powers, different cultures, already plugged into the global network.
Yeah, the stage is set for complexity.
Okay, so moving forward a bit, we get into what's often called India's classical period, roughly AD 320 to 550. And the big name here is the Gupta Empire.
The Golden Age.
Right. Founded by Chandragupta III, expanded by Samudragupta, peak under Chandragupta II Vikramaditya. Everyone calls it the Golden Age. But, why? What actually earned it that title?
It really did earn it, and for several concrete reasons. First, you had strong, centralized rule, military success.
Which provides stability.
Exactly. And that stability wasn't just about peace, it was the fertile ground for culture to just explode. Classical Sanskrit culture thrived. You get literary giants like Kalidasa writing masterpieces, Shakuntala, Meghaduta.
Things still read today.
Absolutely. And it's also when the Puranas were compiled and the big epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, reached something close to their final forms.
So a huge literary flourishing.
Huge. But it went way beyond literature. The scientific and mathematical breakthroughs, genuinely groundbreaking.
This is where Aryabhata comes in.
Yes, around AD 499, he calculated pi, understood the Earth rotates on its axis, and was key in developing the place value system, the decimal system we use.
Which is fundamental.
It changed everything. And Brahmagupta built on that, establishing rules for arithmetic, really nailing down the concept of zero as a number with its own properties.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate the impact of that, isn't it? Zero in the decimal system.
It revolutionized mathematics globally, full stop, laid the foundation for modern everything, really.
Wow. And this intellectual energy, it wasn't just happening in isolation, right? there were institutions.
Oh, absolutely. This is when you see the founding of places like Nalanda University. And these weren't just schools, they were like global intellectual hubs.
Attracting scholars from all over Asia.
Yeah, from Tibet, China, Southeast Asia. People came to learn, debate. India was kind of the Silicon Valley of ancient learning for centuries. And you had others too, like Vikramasila, Taktasila.
So centers of learning, literature, maths.
Yeah.
What about arts and architecture?
Also flourishing. You start to see the Nagara style, the North Indian temple style, really begin to emerge. Plus, incredible rock-cut architecture, like at Udayagiri.
And the caves, Ajanta and Ellora.
Masterpieces. From this period, roughly 5th to 7th centuries, showing Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain art, which points to another key aspect.
Religious coexistence.
Yeah. Even though you see a Hindu revival starting, Buddhism and Jainism were still very much alive and thriving, often peacefully alongside each other.
It really paints a picture of, well, immense growth, collaboration, stability fostering creativity. That's the real aha for me there. Stability isn't just lack of war. It's the engine for this kind of explosion.
That's a perfect way to put it, but unfortunately, even golden ages don't last forever.
Right. So the decline of the Guptas, what happened?
Well, the period between roughly 80, 550, and 600 saw major problems. The big external factor was devastating invasions by the Hunas, these tribes from Central Asia.
A huge shock to the system.
Definitely. But it was probably coupled with some internal decay, too. It wasn't just one thing. And the result was significant fragmentation.
So the Huna invasions were the big external blow. But I wonder, how strong were the Gupta internal structures by then? And maybe, were regional powers already kind of strong, making fragmentation almost inevitable once that central power weakened?
That's a really sharp question. Yes, the fragmentation likely wasn't just about the invasions. Those underlying regional identities and power bases were already there, quite strong in many cases. The invasions were maybe the catalyst or the final push.
Because this decline, it wasn't an end point, was it? It actually triggered the rise of new powers.
Exactly, a new phase. For a while, you had Harsha Harshavardhana, who managed to pull together a large territory in North India, but only briefly, AD 606 to 647.
A temporary reunification.
Right. And later, things get really fragmented, leading to what historians call the tripartite struggle.
Ah, yes, the three-way fight.
Yeah, basically a long power struggle for control over key areas, mainly in the north. The players were the Rashtrakutas, based in the Deccan.
Powerful southern kingdom pushing north.
Right. Then the Palace in Bengal, they're interesting because they were major patrons of Buddhism quite late on.
Keeping it alive in the east.
And the third group were the Pratiharas, based in North India, a real messy period of shifting alliances and warfare.
And meanwhile, down south?
Down south, by the late 9th century, the Cholas are starting their big comeback, the beginnings of what would become their massive maritime empire later on.
So a real shift from a dominant central empire to competing regional powers.
Absolutely. And this political fragmentation, it connects directly to a major religious shift we need to talk about.
Okay.
This is when we see Buddhism really start to decline significantly in most parts of India after about AD 600.
Losing ground.
Yeah, big time. Exceptions were places like Bihar and Bengal, especially under the Buddhist Pala kings, and Nepal. But elsewhere, it faded. And this coincided largely with the growing dominance of Shaivism and Vaishnavism within Hinduism.
Interesting. So political change and religious change going hand in hand.
Often they do.
And then towards the end of our millennium, another really major development happens.
You mean the arrival of Islam as a political force?
Exactly. The Arab conquest of Sind in AD 712, led by Muhammad bin Qasim. Now, Islam had reached India earlier, right? Through traders.
Oh, for sure. By the 7th century, you had Arab Muslim traders and communities in coastal areas like Kerala, Gujarat, peaceful interaction mostly.
But 712 is different.
Yes, 712 marks the beginning of a formal political Islamic presence on the subcontinent, a new chapter opening.
Okay, let's circle back to those religious developments because they're so central. You mentioned the Hindu revival.
Right. Under the Guptas, you already see the roots of the Bhakti movement starting to form this emphasis on personal, loving devotion to a deity.
More accessible, maybe?
Perhaps, yeah. And by AD 1000, Shaivism, devotion to Shiva, and Vaishnavism, devotion to Vishnu, are really the dominant forms of Hinduism across most of India.
And temples become more important.
Hugely important. They transform into these central hubs, not just for worship, but for the economy, education, social life. Real power centers in their own right.
Okay, so Hinduism is ascending. What about Buddhism's trajectory then?
Well, after its peak under the Kushans and Guptas, which saw Mahayana and later Vajrayana forms grow significantly, it really did decline post 700s in many areas.
Why, though? Loss of patronage.
That was a big part of it. Losing royal patronage was critical. And maybe also losing some popular support to the revitalized Hindu movements. Its main centers of influence shifted.
But Jainism managed to hold on.
It did, yeah. Jainism remained influential, especially in western India, like Gujarat and Rajasthan and parts of the south. Jain communities were often very prominent in trade and commerce, and they maintained their distinct practices and identity.
So these religious shifts, how did they actually influence the daily lives and worldviews of ordinary people? That feels like the big question.
That is a huge question and probably deserves its own deep dive. The impact would have been profound, shaping everything from daily rituals to social structures to views on life and death.
Definitely food for thought. Okay, shifting gears slightly, but related to that Gupta Golden Age. Let's revisit those incredible intellectual contributions.
The science and maths again.
Yeah, because we touched on Aryabhata and Brahmagupta, 0, the decimal system. But it's worth just pausing on the sheer revolutionary impact of those ideas. Can you even imagine modern science or commerce or computing without them?
Honestly, no, it's foundational. And their work just laid the bedrock for so much more. Take astronomy. Beyond Aryabhata figuring out the Earth rotates and explaining eclipses.
Which is already amazing.
Right. You also had figures like Varahamihira who made huge contributions to understanding celestial stuff. And importantly, he integrated Greek and Indian astronomical knowledge.
So not just isolated invention, but synthesis too.
Exactly. A real convergence of global ideas happening right there.
And medicine.
Ayurveda really flourished in this period. You get these key texts solidified, like the Sushruta Samhita, incredible detail on surgical techniques, instruments.
Surgery, really?
Oh, yeah, quite advanced for the time. And the Charaka Samhita focusing more on internal medicine, medicinal plants, preventive health, a very sophisticated system.
Wow. And what about technology? Any standout examples?
Well, the classic example has to be the Iron Pillar of Delhi.
The one that doesn't rust.
Exactly. It stood there for over 1,500 years through monsoons and everything and has barely corroded. It's a stunning testament to their advanced metallurgy skills. You almost want to ask them how they did it, right?
You really do. Like, what was the secret? That intellectual power, the universities like Nalanda, it really made India a magnet, didn't it?
A beacon of learning for Asia, absolutely. And this knowledge wasn't just developed in ivory towers, it was connected to a pretty robust economy.
Right, that's the other side of the coin. What was driving the economy back then?
Well, the absolute backbone was agriculture, no question. But beyond the farms, you had really well-organized artisan production and trade networks, often managed by powerful guilds.
Guilds like craft associations.
Sorta, yeah. Managing quality, prices, training. And international trade was seriously robust.
What were they trading?
India was exporting high-value stuff, spices, textiles, cottons and silks, gemstones, ivory, and importing things like good quality horses, which were important for cavalry, more silk from China, wine, glass.
And the reach of these trade networks, we mentioned Rome earlier.
Yeah, the Roman trade, especially through southern ports like Muziris and Kerala, was huge in the early part of our period. But beyond that, you had extensive routes connecting India overland via the Silk Road to Persia and China, and maritime routes across the Indian Ocean linking to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean.
It makes you realize just how interconnected the ancient world was. It wasn't isolated pockets.
Not at all. And the quality of, say, the Gupta gold coins, they speak volumes about the sophistication of the economy and these trade links. They were widely accepted, high purity.
Okay, economy thriving, ideas spreading.
Mm-hmm.
What about society itself? How is it structured?
Well, the ancient Varna system, the 4 broad categories, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, that framework became increasingly rigid over this millennium.
Less flexible.
Much less flexible. And the more granular caste system, the Jasi system, based often on occupation or locality, that really crystallized further, especially in the early medieval period after the Guptas.
What did that mean for people?
It meant social mobility. The chance to sort of move up or change your inherited status became really quite rare. Your birth largely determined your occupation and social standing.
And the position of women. You mentioned scholars earlier, but generally.
Generally, a consensus is that the position of women, while there were exceptions, declined notably after the Gupta period. Their rights and freedoms seem to have become more limited compared to earlier times.
Interesting. And what about where people lived? Cities versus villages?
There seems to have been a bit of a decline in urban life after the Gupta era faded. Some cities shrank or were abandoned. Gradually, you see the rise of temple towns as important centers. But the vast majority of the population lived in villages, engaged in agriculture and local crafts. Rural life dominated.
Okay. Now, we touched on art, but let's dive back into the visual legacy. It's just so rich. We mentioned Gandhara art's unique blend
By that Greco-Buddhist style.
and the rock-cut architecture, like Udayagiri, and those Ajanta and Ellora caves, the sheer scale, and the fact they have Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain art all together.
It's incredible. It really speaks to that period of interaction and often coexistence.
Okay.
Ellora especially is mind-blowing.
And temple architecture was evolving, too.
Definitely. You see distinct regional styles emerging. The Nagara style in North India, with its characteristic Shikara tower, starts taking shape.
Right.
And down south, in Tamil Nadu, the Dravidian style of temple architecture is evolving, really pushed forward by the Cholas towards the end of our period, around AD 900. Think of those early Chola temples.
And wasn't there that one temple carved from a single rock?
Ah, the Kailasa temple at Ellora, yes. Not built, but excavated downwards out of the solid rock. An absolutely staggering feat of engineering and artistry from the Rashtrakuta period, around the 8th century.
Just unbelievable. Okay, what about language? We mentioned Sanskrit and Prakrit.
Right. Sanskrit remained the language of the elite, religion, philosophy, high literature. Prakrit and Pali were very important, especially for Buddhist and Jain texts earlier on.
But other languages were emerging, too.
Crucially, yes. This millennium sees the significant rise and development of regional languages, Tamil, which already had a long literary tradition, but also Kannada, Telugu, early forms of Bengali, Marathi. They start developing their own distinct literatures and identities.
So a linguistic diversification happening.
Yeah, mirrored in the scripts too. The ancient Brahmi script evolved into the Gupta script, and from that, you get the development of early Nagari in the north and various southern scripts. This divergence really reflects the growing regional cultures and identities across the subcontinent.
So, wrapping this all up, what's the big picture? When we look back at India from 80 to 1000, what should we take away?
I think the main takeaway is the sheer dynamism. It was a millennium of absolutely profound transformations.
Yeah, you go from these powerful unifying empires like the Kushans and Guptas.
Right, to this complex mosaic of competing, vibrant regional kingdoms.
You have scientific leaps that literally changed the world zero, the decimal system.
Incredible artistic expression, from intricate sculptures to monumental temples and caves.
And these deep shifts in society and religion shaping how people lived, how they saw the world.
It was constant change, constant evolution.
Yeah, incredible dynamism sums it up well.
And it's important to remember, even with the political fragmentation after the Guptas, there was still remarkable cultural continuity in many ways.
Things carried on.
Exactly. And you see the beginnings of a kind of regional renaissance. This whole period laid the essential groundwork for medieval India, its temple culture, its distinct regional identities. So much of that has its roots right here in this millennium.
So, as a final thought for everyone listening, maybe something to chew on.
Go on.
How do these deep historical shifts in who held power and how society was structured and which religions were dominant, how do those changes from over 1,000 years ago still echo today? Where can you see the influence of that millennium in the cultural tapestry of India or even the world around you now?
That's a great question to end on. Look for those connections. They're often there, sometimes in surprising ways.